Tonight, I want you to stand with me in a doorway, a simple doorway of a home made of mud and brick 2,000 years ago. From here, you can see the world of men pass by on the dusty road outside, the soldiers, the traders, the religious leaders. But from this same doorway, you can also see the entire world of the woman who lives within. The hearth, where she creates warmth. The loom, where she weaves a future. The children she raises to carry on a promise. This was her kingdom. And from this small kingdom, she would find the strength to change the one outside forever. If you find a sense of peace in stories about the incredible power found in everyday life, feel free to like or subscribe. It's always nice to know who is standing in this quiet doorway with me, so let me know where you're listening from. So let the noise from the road outside fade away. Let the world be framed by this simple doorway, and let's see the world through her eyes. Chapter 1. The Clay Jar. The first light of dawn had not yet breached the horizon, but the village was already stirring with the quiet, purposeful energy of its women. Martha's small, calloused fingers tightened around the familiar rough handle of her clay water jar, the cool morning air raising goosebumps on her arms. At 12 years old, this daily pilgrimage to the well was as much a part of her as her own breath. She moved through the narrow, dusty paths, her sandals making soft, rhythmic scuffs against the earth, a sound mirrored by the other shadowy figures converging on the same lifeline. She watched them, these pillars of her world. They carried their own jars, their backs straight despite the weight they bore, their heads often tilted together in low, murmured conversations that wove the fabric of the community. Their hands, chapped and strong, were never still, adjusting a shawl, soothing a child on a hip, or already kneading the memory of sleep from tired muscles. Martha saw the grace in their movements, a silent, uncomplaining strength that seemed to flow from some deep, hidden well within them, as vital as the water they sought. Her own mother walked beside her, a steady, calming presence. Later, as Martha helped her prepare the morning meal, grinding grain into flour, her mother spoke. Her voice was low and even, a thread of continuity in the hum of the waking household. She spoke of their duties, not as a list of chores, but as sacred threads in a tapestry. The grinding of wheat, the weaving of cloth, the tending of the hearth, the raising of children. Each act was a prayer of sustenance, a brick in the foundation of home and village. It was a tradition passed from mother to daughter for generations, an unbroken chain of quiet service. Martha felt the weight of that expectation settle on her young shoulders, a tangible pressure as real as the clay jar she had carried. It was the weight of a future already mapped by the footsteps of the women before her. For a moment, it felt immense, a path with no turns, a story already written. A flutter of uncertainty rose in her chest, a silent question about the shape of her own life within this predetermined design. But then her hands found their rhythm in the grinding, the repetitive circular motion, a meditation. The coarse grain yielded to the stone, transforming into something soft and useful. She watched her mother's hands, swift and sure as they shaped the dough, and the anxiety began to ebb. There was a profound comfort in this rhythm, in the certainty of the tasks. This was not just work. It was a language of love, a silent strength that held families together and allowed the village to endure. The weight was still there, but it was no longer a burden. It was an anchor, connecting her to the earth, to her mother, To all the mothers who had come before, in the quiet fulfillment of her duty, Martha found her first small understanding of what it meant to be a woman. Chapter 2. The Storyteller's Fire. The day's heat surrendered to the cool embrace of evening, and the village gathered around the central fire, its flames licking at the purple twilight. Sparks spiraled upward like fleeing stars, and the scent of burning olive wood wove a fragrant canopy over the hushed crowd. Martha sat close to her grandmother, the old woman's face a landscape of wrinkles carved by sun and time, each line seeming to hold a story of its own. The firelight danced in her wise, dark eyes, transforming them into pools of liquid gold as she drew a slow breath, preparing to speak. The air itself seemed to lean in, waiting. Her voice, when it came, was a low, resonant instrument, a river of sound that carried them all away from their Judean hills to the oppressive banks of the Nile. She painted a picture of a desperate time, of a cruel decree, and a mother's terrible choice. She spoke of Jochebed's faith, a fierce, quiet flame that refused to be extinguished, as she daubed pitch on a tiny basket, placing her son's fate into the hands of God and the river's current. But then the grandmother's tone shifted, sharpening with a new watchful energy. She introduced Miriam, not as a child, but as a sentinel. Martha saw her clearly in her mind's eye, a young girl, scarcely older than herself, standing hidden among the reeds, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The grandmother described the glint of the sun on the royal barge, the laughter of the princess and her attendants as they approached the water. Martha felt the paralyzing fear Miriam must have known, the terror of being discovered, the crushing weight of responsibility for a baby brother's life. But then came the pivot, the moment of breathtaking courage. When the princess discovered the crying infant, Miriam did not freeze or flee. Her faith propelled her forward, her mind working with a clarity that belied her years. She stepped from the reeds, her suggestion to find a Hebrew nurse not a desperate plea, but a divinely inspired strategy. The fire crackled, punctuating the tale's brilliance. Miriam's quick thinking had not only saved her brother, but had returned him to the arms of his own mother, ensuring he would know his heritage even within the walls of a palace. It was a victory won not with a sword, but with wisdom and audacious faith. The grandmother finished, letting the silence hang for a moment, the echo of Miriam's courage reverberating in the stillness. As the others began to murmur and shift, Martha remained motionless, staring into the heart of the fire. The story had ignited something within her. The rhythmic, silent strength of the women at the well was one thing, a deep, enduring current. But this was different. This was a spark, a flash of decisive action. Miriam had not just endured, she had changed the course of events. She had been an active participant in God's plan, her faith a weapon against despair. That night, lying on her pallet, Martha did not dream of water jars or grinding stones. She dreamed of river reeds and the glint of a princess's crown. She felt the ghost of that ancient courage stirring in her own soul, a small, bright ember fanned to life by her grandmother's words. The expectations of her life still stretched before her, a path of duty and service. But now she saw that the path might have branches. It might require more than quiet endurance. It might one day demand the swift, brave step from the reeds. Before sleep finally took her, Martha made a silent vow into the darkness, a promise to the memory of a sister who watched by a river. She would be brave. She would be ready. Chapter 3. The Judge's Decree. The heat of the day had begun to wane when a traveler's silhouette appeared at the edge of the village, stirring the dust on the road that led from the hills. He was an elder from a neighboring settlement, his staff gnarled by miles and years, his robe bleached pale by the relentless sun. The news of his arrival spread, a current of anticipation that pulled the villagers from their tasks. They gathered in the broad open space near the well, children perched on walls and women pausing with their weaving in their laps. Martha found a place beside her mother, her heart quickening with the unspoken promise of a story. The elder settled on a low stone, accepting a cup of water with a nod of thanks. His eyes, deep-set and keen, scanned the faces around him, holding a knowledge that seemed to stretch back to the foundations of the world. He began to speak, his voice a low rumble that commanded the very air to stillness. He did not speak of kings in palaces or warriors with flashing swords. He spoke of a woman. Her name was Deborah, and she judged Israel beneath a palm tree between Ramah and Bethel. He painted her not as a figure of softness, but of formidable clarity. People came to her from across the land, bringing their bitterest disputes and most tangled conflicts. She listened, her wisdom cutting through deception and pride like a sharp blade through chaff, rendering judgments that were fair and unshakable. But she was more than a judge. She was a prophetess, a vessel through which the very word of the Lord flowed. The elder's voice swelled as he described the day the command came to her, the call to rally the tribes against the Canaanite king who oppressed them with 900 chariots of iron. She sent for Barak, a commander of armies, and delivered God's promise of victory. A ripple of unease went through the listeners. A woman commanding a war? But the elder's tale rushed on, a torrent of divine purpose. Barak's faith faltered. He would only go if Deborah went with him, and she did. She rose from her place beneath the palm tree and marched with the armies of Israel into the face of certain destruction, not as a mere observer, but as their guide, their living symbol of God's presence. The elder described the clash on Mount Tabor, the heavens themselves joining the fray, and the enemy general Sisera fleeing the field only to meet his end by the hand of another woman, Jael, in her tent. It was a victory orchestrated not by the strongest warrior, but through the unwavering faith and leadership of a woman. The story ended, leaving a profound silence in its wake. The villagers dispersed slowly, the image of Deborah seated in leadership, commanding men and nations burning in their minds. For Martha, the world had subtly shifted on its axis. The courage of Miriam by the river had been a solitary, desperate act. But this was different. This was sustained, public authority. A woman had led all Israel. She had spoken for God, and men had listened. The quiet, rhythmic duties of the household, which had always felt like the entirety of a woman's world, now seemed to be only one room in a much larger house. Later, while mending a tear in her brother's tunic, she found her friend Rebekah working beside her. The words tumbled out of Martha in a hushed, fervent stream. Could a woman's voice truly carry such weight? Could she lead not just a household, but a people? Rebekah's needle paused, her expression a mixture of curiosity and caution. That was then, she seemed to say with a slight shake of her head. Deborah was a singular miracle, an exception in a time of crisis. A woman's place was here, she insisted, her gestures taking in the courtyard, the hearth, the children. Her strength was in the foundation she built, not in the battles she fought. Leadership was the domain of men. It was the order of things, the way it had always been. But Martha could not let the idea go. It had rooted itself too deeply. The debate between them was quiet, a tension of opposing worldviews stitched into the fabric of their friendship. Martha spoke of the evidence of the story, of the judge who was also a mother in Israel. Rebekah spoke of tradition, of the safety and sanctity of their defined roles. They did not raise their voices, but the divide between them felt as vast as the Jordan. As they put away their sewing, Martha felt a new restless energy coursing through her. The story of the judge's decree had not just been a tale of past victory. It had been a key, turning a lock in her mind, opening a door to a future she had never before dared to imagine. Chapter 4. The daily grind. The weight of the story settled into Martha's bones as dawn broke, not as inspiration, but as another layer of exhaustion. The heroic figures of Miriam and Deborah seemed distant, shimmering mirages compared to the gritty reality of the grain spread before her on the grinding stone. This was the truth of her life, the unglamorous foundation upon which all tales were built. Her small hands, already toughened from years of chores, gripped the smaller upper stone, and she began the relentless, circular motion that would transform hard kernels into soft, usable flour. The rhythmic scrape and crush of stone on stone became the day's first mantra. A fine golden dust rose to coat her arms and cling to the dampness at her temples. With each rotation, her shoulders burned, a dull, persistent ache that deepened with the sun's ascent. Her mind, which had soared with prophets and judges the night before, was now tethered firmly to the physical, counting the rotations, measuring the slow accumulation of meal in the basin. Her younger siblings, a tangle of limbs and noise, tumbled around the courtyard, their needs a constant distracting chorus. She paused only to wipe a sweaty brow, to settle a squabble, or to lift the crying toddler onto her hip, his weight a familiar counterbalance to the grindstone's pull. When the last of the grain was finally ground, her muscles trembled with a spent feeling. But there was no rest. The loom stood waiting in the shaded corner of the house, its vertical frame a skeleton, begging for flesh. She settled before it, her back protesting the new posture. The shuttle, loaded with coarse, undyed wool, became an extension of her will. She passed it through the warped threads, her movements precise and practiced, her focus narrowing to the growing tapestry of plain, sturdy cloth. This was a different kind of patience, a silent, meticulous building row upon row. The click-clack of the heddles was a quieter music than the grindstone's grind, but no less demanding. Her vision blurred at the edges, the repetitive pattern lulling her toward a stupor even as her hands continued their work. It was during a brief respite, as she fetched water for the household, that she overheard the whispers. A cluster of men spoke in low, urgent tones by the village gate, their faces etched with a new worry. The words Roman census and heavy tribute snaked through the air, carried on the dry wind. The fragments of conversation painted a picture of impending hardship, of hard-won coins and goods being siphoned away to feed a distant, indifferent empire. A cold knot tightened in Martha's stomach, a fear far more immediate than any theological debate. Her father's furrowed brow at supper now made sense. The extra hours he spent in the fields were not just for their own sustenance, but a desperate race against a coming tax. The knowledge settled over her like a shroud, adding a psychic weight to her physical fatigue. Every scoop of flour, every length of woven cloth, now felt like a tiny fortress against an encroaching threat. Her resilience, once a quiet, personal quality, now felt like a communal necessity. She returned to the loom, her movements infused with a new, grim determination. The exhaustion was still there, a deep well she drew from, but she refused to let it overwhelm her. She wove not just cloth, but a barrier against fear. She ground the grain not just for bread, but for survival. In the relentless, mundane cycle of her tasks, Martha discovered a profound truth. Sometimes the greatest courage was not in the single heroic act, but in the simple, stubborn refusal to be broken by the daily grind. Chapter 5. The Silent Strength. The stories of public prophets and battlefield judges still echoed in Martha's mind, but it was her mother's quiet voice that finally gave them a home in her heart. They sat together in the cool of the evening, shelling lentils into a wide clay bowl, the tiny hard discs pinging softly as they accumulated. The day's exhaustion clung to Martha, a fine dust on her skin and a heaviness in her limbs. Her mother's hands, however, moved with their usual steady grace, their rhythm a silent counterpoint to Martha's own restless fidgeting. Without preamble, her mother began to speak, her voice a low, soothing stream. She did not speak of thrones or battles, but of a small, dark room in Egypt, of a mother's whispered prayers and the frantic, loving work of her hands. She told Martha of Jochebed, a woman whose name meant Yahweh is glory, but whose life was defined by a terrible, hidden fear. She described the 3 long months Jochebed hid her infant son, Moses, from the soldiers of Pharaoh. Every cry had to be stifled, every footfall outside the door a potential death knell. Her courage was not witnessed by crowds or recorded in songs. It was measured in the frantic beat of her heart, in the way she learned to soothe her child into silence, in the agonizing faith it took to weave a tiny basket, coat it with pitch, and place her most precious treasure into the hands of God and the treacherous Nile. This, her mother explained, her eyes holding Martha's with a sudden, piercing intensity, was the foundation of all strength. This was the hidden courage of mothers, the unheralded battles fought in the shadows of homes, the fierce, quiet love that defied empires. It was a strength that did not seek recognition, a faith that trusted in the unseen outcome. Jochebed's act had required a different kind of bravery than Deborah's, a bravery of surrender, of hope in the midst of heartbreak, of trusting a plan larger than her own. The lesson settled deep within Martha, finding the weary, hollow places left by the day's grind and filling them with a new sense of purpose. The next morning, as she carried water from the well, she saw a commotion outside a neighboring home. Sarah, a young mother whose husband was away with a trading caravan, stood weeping in her doorway, her face a mask of despair. Her youngest child was feverish, burning with an illness that had stolen his strength and his cries, leaving him limp and silent in her arms. The other village women clucked their tongues with pity, but kept a cautious distance, their own burdens too great to bear another's. Martha paused, the weight of her full water jar pulling at her shoulders. She thought of Jochebed, of a mother's solitary terror. Without a second thought, she set her jar down and crossed the dusty path. She did not offer empty words of comfort. Instead, she simply placed a hand on Sarah's trembling arm, a silent anchor in the storm of her fear. Then she moved into the dim, stuffy interior of the home. She found a clean cloth and a basin of cool water and began the slow, methodical work of bathing the child's fevered skin. She sent Sarah's older daughter to fetch specific herbs from her own mother's stores, and she took over the simple tasks of the household, stirring the pot of thin broth, sweeping the floor, creating small islands of order in the sea of chaos and fear. Her presence was a quiet, practical application of the lesson she had just learned. It was not a dramatic rescue, but a shared burden. It was the strength of simply showing up, of doing what needed to be done without fanfare or expectation of reward. She stayed for hours, until the child's fever broke and he fell into a natural, exhausted sleep, and until the wild panic in Sarah's eyes had been replaced by a weary, profound gratitude. That night, alone on her pallet, Martha did not dream of leading armies or judging nations. Instead, she folded her hands in the darkness and looked inward. The stories were no longer just tales of other women in other times. They were a mirror. She saw Miriam's quick thinking, Deborah's resolve, and now Jochebed's hidden fortitude, and she understood that these were not separate strengths, but different facets of the same faith. Her prayer was not for a specific kind of courage, but for the inner strength to recognize which one was needed and to act upon it, whether in the shadowed quiet of a sick room or under the open sky. She prayed for a heart like Jochebed's, strong enough to hold both fear and faith, and to trust in the silent unfolding plan of God. Chapter 6, The Foreign Woman. The air itself seemed to shimmer with abundance. The harvest festival transformed the village, the usual dust and toil replaced by the sweet, heavy scent of crushed grapes and freshly baked bread, garlands of late-blooming flowers, and olive branches draped the simple stone houses, and the threshing floor, once a place of back-breaking labor, was now the heart of the celebration, strewn with sweet-smelling straw. Laughter and music wove through the crowd, a tapestry of joy woven from months of hard-won yield. Martha moved through the festivities, the rhythmic pulse of the drum echoing the steady, grateful beat of her own heart. She carried a basket of ripe figs, their purple skins dusted with a faint bloom, a small offering to the communal feast. As the sun began its descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and rose, the village elder raised his hands for silence. The music faded, and the chatter stilled, all eyes turning toward him. He did not speak of battles or judges tonight, but of a story woven from loss and loyalty, a tale for the harvest. He began to speak of Ruth, the Moabite woman. He painted a picture of desolation, a Judean family fleeing famine, finding refuge in a foreign land only to meet with death, leaving behind 3 widows bound by grief. He spoke of Naomi's bitter decision to return home alone and of Ruth's breathtaking response. The elder's voice softened, imbued with a profound reverence as he recited the words that had echoed down through generations, a vow that transcended blood and nation. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Martha listened, utterly captivated. She saw Ruth not as a foreigner, but as a woman of unshakable loyalty, choosing a destitute mother-in-law over the chance of security in her own homeland. She followed Naomi to Bethlehem, a stranger in a land that might despise her origins, and she went to work in the fields, gleaning behind the harvesters under the hot sun, her hands scraping for stray grains to keep them both from starvation. But the story did not end in hardship. The elder's voice swelled with the theme of redemption as he described Boaz, a kinsman who saw not her foreignness, but her character. He became her guardian redeemer, restoring her place and her future, weaving her, the Moabitess, directly into the lineage of King David himself. As the tale concluded, Martha's gaze drifted from the elder's face to the edges of the crowd. Her eyes fell upon a woman she had not noticed before, sitting slightly apart on a low wall. Her dress was of a slightly different cut, her features sharper, her complexion weathered by sun and travel. She was clearly not from their village, nor from any of the nearby Judean settlements. She was a foreigner like Ruth, her presence a living echo of the story just told. Martha watched her, seeing not an outsider, but a person. She saw the woman's quiet observation, the way her hands rested calmly in her lap, and a deep, unexpected wave of empathy washed over her. The story of Ruth had dismantled a wall in Martha's mind. God's plan was not a small, exclusive thing reserved only for the children of Abraham. It was a vast, inclusive tapestry, and he used whomever he willed, a Moabite widow, a young Judean girl, anyone with a faithful heart, to weave its threads. The loyalty of an outsider had been instrumental in the grand story of redemption. This realization felt like a key turning in her soul, unlocking a chamber of compassion she had not known was there. When the feasting began, Martha did not stay within the comfortable circle of her friends and family. Instead, she took her basket of figs and walked toward the solitary traveler. The woman looked up as Martha approached, her expression guarded but not unfriendly. Martha offered the figs with a small tentative smile, a simple gesture of welcome. The woman's eyes widened in slight surprise, then softened. She accepted the gift with a nod of thanks, her own lips curving into a hesitant smile in return. Martha sat beside her on the sun-warmed stone, and for a long moment they simply sat in silence, watching the celebration unfold before them. No words were needed. The shared space, the offered figs, the unspoken understanding, it was a beginning. In the fading light of the harvest festival, surrounded by the joy of her own people, Martha had reached across an invisible divide. She had chosen to see the image of God in a stranger's face, and in doing so, she had befriended the foreign traveler, making the ancient story of Ruth a living, breathing truth in her own life. Chapter 7. The Queen's Risk. A single, uninvited step into the king's inner court could mean death. This stark truth hung in the air of the storyteller's circle, a chilling counterpoint to the warm, familiar safety of the village evening. The tale tonight was not of prophets in the open air or judges beneath palm trees, but of perfumed corridors and the gilded cage of a Persian palace. The elder's voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper as he spun the story of Esther, the beautiful Jewish orphan who had become queen. Her heritage, a secret buried deep beneath royal silks and the weight of a crown. He painted a picture of terrifying opulence, of a king whose word was absolute law, and of a villain, Haman, whose pride festered into a genocidal plot against the entire Jewish people. A decree of annihilation was sealed with the king's own ring, irrevocable and deadly. The fate of thousands hung in the balance, and the only one who could possibly intervene was the queen, hidden in the heart of the enemy's stronghold. The elder described the message from her cousin Mordecai, a stark challenge that pierced through her royal comfort. "And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" Martha sat frozen, her breath caught in her throat. She could almost feel the cold marble floors of the palace, smell the heavy incense, and sense the paralyzing fear that must have gripped Esther's heart. This was not a call to lead an army, but to walk alone into the lion's den. The courage required was of a different, more intimate kind. The courage to risk everything, to lay her life on the line with a single, unscripted appearance before a capricious monarch. The elder described her resolve, a faith that moved from passive hiding to audacious action. "If I perish, I perish," she declared, and then, with her maids, she entered into a 3-day fast, preparing not with weapons, but with prayer and desperation. The story unfolded with breathless tension, the extended golden scepter, the queen's trembling approach, the cunningly laid banquets, and the final dramatic unveiling of Haman's plot. The victory, when it came, was overwhelming, a tide of justice turned by the bravery of one woman who had dared to use her position, however perilous, for the salvation of her people. It was faith in its most potent, active form, not a quiet belief, but a risk. Everything leap into the purposes of God. As the villagers dispersed, murmuring about the triumph of their ancestors, Martha remained seated, the story burning inside her. Esther's influence had not been in public proclamation, but in a private, terrifying gamble. Her sphere was a palace, not a battlefield, yet her actions had altered the course of history. Martha looked at her own small world, the clay jars, the grinding stone, the familiar faces of her family and neighbors. Her conflicts were not matters of life and death for a nation, but they were real. The quiet tension with Rebecca over their differing views, the subtle pressures of betrothal discussions that had begun to swirl around her, the daily struggle against resentment in the endless cycle of chores. These were her palace, her inner court. That night, kneeling by her pallet, the words of Esther's prayer echoed in her own heart. She did not pray for a royal crown or a dramatic moment of salvation. She prayed for the courage to step into her own small conflicts, to speak with kindness where there was disagreement, to act with integrity when it would be easier to remain silent, to bear the weight of expectation without losing the core of who she was. She prayed for the faith to believe that her small life, her seemingly insignificant choices, mattered in a story far larger than she could see. She prayed not to be a queen, but to have the heart of one, a heart willing to risk comfort for the sake of what was right, to translate faith from a quiet feeling into a decisive, life-altering action. Chapter 8, the prophet's word, the discovery of a forgotten scroll in the temple, its words a thunderclap of conviction and promise, sent ripples of awe and terror through the kingdom. The story reached Martha's village not as a dry historical account, but as a living, breathing drama of divine intervention. The high priest Hilkiah had found the book of the law, and King Josiah, upon hearing its words, had torn his robes in a paroxysm of fear and repentance. But it was the next part of the story that struck Martha with the force of a physical blow. The king did not turn only to the male priests or elders for confirmation. He sent his officials to a woman Huldah, the prophetess, who dwelt in the Mishneh, the second quarter of Jerusalem. The elder telling the story described her not as a curiosity, but as an established, revered authority. She was a wife, a woman rooted in the domestic life of the city, yet her home was also a place of prophecy. When the king's men, laden with the weight of their desperate question, came to her, she did not demur or defer. She spoke with the direct, unshakable authority of one who stood in the counsel of the Lord. She authenticated the scroll as the very word of God and delivered a devastating prophecy of judgment for Judah's faithlessness, tempered with the promise of peace for the repentant king. Her word became the foundation for a national reformation, a great cleansing of idols and a renewal of the covenant. A woman's voice had been the final authoritative seal on Scripture itself. This revelation settled over Martha with a profound and quiet finality. It was the missing piece, the theological keystone that locked all the other stories into a coherent whole. Miriam's initiative, Deborah's leadership, Ruth's inclusion, Esther's risk, they were not flukes or exceptions. Huldah's story demonstrated that a woman could be a direct conduit for God's word, her spiritual authority recognized at the highest levels of society. Her role was not in spite of her womanhood, but flowed through it, a testament that the Spirit was no respecter of gender. A new, insatiable hunger awoke in Martha. The Scriptures, which had before been the distant domain of scribes, and the lections read at festivals, now felt intimately personal. A vast and unexplored country she was suddenly determined to map. She began to seek out every opportunity to learn. She lingered near the synagogue when the men discussed the texts, her ears straining to catch the sacred words. She asked her grandmother to recount not just the stories of heroines, but the laws and the psalms, the promises and the prophecies. She found an old, partially unrolled scroll in her home, a genealogy, and she would trace the names with her finger, whispering them aloud, feeling the connection to the great tapestry of her people. The words were no longer black marks on parchment, they were living water, and she drank them in with a thirst she had never known she possessed. This new-found passion soon met its first test. She was sitting with a group of girls her age, and she began to excitedly recount what she had learned about Huldah, her voice animated with the thrill of discovery. One of the girls, a practical-minded child named Tirzah, frowned. "Why do you trouble yourself with such things?" she asked, her tone not unkind, but dismissive. "That is for the men to study and debate. Our part is to listen and obey." The words were a bucket of cold water, a direct challenge to the truth that had so recently set her soul on fire. Martha felt a flush rise to her cheeks, but it was not from embarrassment. It was a righteous heat, a spark kindled by the memory of a prophetess in Jerusalem. She looked at Tirzah and then at the other girls whose faces were a mixture of curiosity and agreement. "Huldah did not only listen," Martha said, her voice quiet but firm, carrying a new weight of conviction. She spoke the word of the Lord to the King of Judah. Her understanding shaped the destiny of a nation. If God entrusted His word to a woman for such a purpose, then He must also desire for women to understand it. To learn it is not to step out of our place. It is to step more fully into the purpose He has for us. She did not raise her voice, but the quiet certainty in her words created a silence around her. Tirzah looked down, considering. Another girl, younger, watched Martha with wide, thoughtful eyes. It was not a loud or dramatic confrontation, but in that moment Martha had defended a woman's right to learn, to seek God with her mind as well as her heart. She had planted a small seed, a testament that the prophet's word was not confined to the past, but was a living invitation, echoing down through the generations, calling even a young girl in a small village to know the mind of her God. Chapter 9. Martha's Betrothal. The news arrived not with a fanfare, but with the quiet, solemn weight of a settled matter. Martha's parents sat with her in the dim, lamp-lit interior of their home, their faces etched with a mixture of pride and inevitability. A good man, they said, a carpenter from a nearby village, known for his skilled hands and steady character. His name was Eliab. The words betrothal and marriage hung in the air, no longer abstract concepts from whispered conversations among the older girls, but the imminent future, solid and real as the stone walls around her. A cold tremor, part fear, part exhilaration, traced its way down Martha's spine. The path of her life, which had felt so expansive after the stories of Deborah and Huldah, suddenly narrowed to a single, predetermined door, and she was being gently, firmly guided toward its threshold. In the days that followed, a restless anxiety took root in her. The familiar rhythms of fetching water and grinding grain felt different, each task now a countdown to a profound change. She watched the married women of the village with new eyes, searching their faces for clues to her own future. She saw the weary slope of a young mother's shoulders as she balanced a child in a water jar, the silent communication of an older couple working side by side in their garden, the occasional fleeting look of deep understanding that passed between a wife and husband. It was a mosaic of partnership and duty, of shared burdens and quiet companionship. But to Martha, it was a language she did not yet speak. Seeking a cipher, she turned to the older women, the guardians of wisdom. She found her grandmother carding wool, her hands moving with an ageless rhythm. The old woman spoke not of romance or passion, but of foundation. Marriage, she said, was the loom upon which a family and a community were woven. It was a sacred duty, a partnership ordained by God for mutual support and the raising of faithful children. Her mother, while kneading dough, offered more practical counsel, the management of a household, the understanding of a man's needs, the silent strength required to be his helpmate. Their guidance was a tapestry of tradition, beautiful in its sturdy, time-worn patterns, but it did little to quiet the flutter of trepidation in Martha's heart. She felt like a single thread being chosen for a vast, pre-designed pattern. Grateful for the purpose, but terrified of losing her own color. The day she met Eliab for their formal discussion was bright and clear, the sun illuminating the small open courtyard where they were left alone, yet within sight of their families. He was taller than she had imagined, with broad shoulders that spoke of his trade and calloused hands that rested calmly on his knees. His eyes were a quiet brown, and they held a genuine, if nervous, kindness. They exchanged the customary halting pleasantries, the air thick with unspoken expectations. Martha's heart hammered against her ribs. This was the man with whom she would build her life, share her home, raise her children. The stories of brave women surged within her, Esther's risk, Deborah's resolve. They had not been passive in their destinies. Summoning a courage she did not know she possessed, Martha took a soft, steadying breath. She looked directly at Eliab, her voice low but clear. She spoke of her faith, of the stories of the women of Israel that had shaped her, of her desire for a home where God's word was honored not just in ritual, but in the daily rhythm of their lives. She did not make demands, but she laid her heart bare, presenting the terms of her spirit. She asked, her voice barely a whisper, if he too valued such things, if he saw their union as more than a transaction between families, but as a partnership before God. Eliab listened, his gaze intent and surprisingly thoughtful. He did not dismiss her words or laugh at her earnestness. Instead, he nodded slowly, a gesture of deep respect. He spoke then, his own voice steady and sure. He told her of his own simple faith, of his desire for a peaceful and righteous home. He acknowledged her learning, her spirit, and to her astonishment, he agreed. He wanted not a silent helper, but a true partner, a woman whose strength would complement his own, whose faith would be the hearth at the center of their home. It was a negotiation not of dowries or property, but of souls. And in that sun-dappled courtyard, amidst the scent of baking bread and flowering herbs, Martha felt the cold knot of fear begin to loosen, replaced by the first fragile tendrils of a hopeful, shared purpose. Chapter 10. The Wedding Veil. The morning of her wedding dawned not with the quiet solitude of water jars and grinding stones, but with a flurry of scented oils, whispered blessings, and the rustle of fine spun linen. Martha sat in the center of a swirl of women, her mother, her grandmother, aunts, and cousins, their hands anointing her skin with fragrant nard and myrrh, their voices weaving a tapestry of joy and ancient ritual around her. The air in the small room was thick with the smell of crushed herbs and excited breath, a stark contrast to the familiar dusty scents of her daily life. She was the still point in this storm of preparation, her own heart a frantic bird beating against the cage of her ribs. This was the threshold, the moment her girlhood ended and her life as a wife began. Then her mother approached, her eyes shining with unshed tears, holding the wedding veil. It was not a flimsy piece of cloth, but a substantial weave of cream-colored wool, embroidered at the edges with deep blue threads in the pattern of pomegranates, a symbol of fertility and blessing. As her mother lifted it, the morning light caught the threads, making them gleam. The weight of the veil, as it settled over her head, was profound, a physical manifestation of the new identity she was assuming. It obscured her vision, casting the world in a soft, golden haze, separating her from the life she had known and marking her as Eliab's. Through the delicate fabric, she could see the shapes of the women moving around her, their faces blurred into smiling masks of love and expectation. She felt the weight of generations of brides in this same moment, a chain of women who had stood where she now stood, veiled and hopeful, stepping from their father's house into a new creation. The procession to Eliab's village was a river of music and color. Flutes trilled a celebratory melody, and the rhythmic beat of the drum seemed to pulse in time with her own heartbeat. She walked, veiled and centered, surrounded by her family and his, the path strewn with petals and sweet herbs that released their fragrance with every step. The communities had merged for this day, their collective joy a tangible force that lifted her and carried her forward. She could hear the laughter of children running alongside the procession, the deep, jovial voices of the men, and the higher melodic chatter of the women. It was no longer just her story or his. It was their story, a new thread being woven into the enduring fabric of the people. The ceremony itself was a blur of solemn words and sacred promises spoken beneath the wedding canopy. The chuppah, its four open sides a symbol of the home they would build together, a home open to hospitality and God's presence. She heard the ancient blessings recited, the same words spoken over Sarah and Rebekah and Rachel. She felt Eliab's hand, warm and steady, as he slipped the simple iron ring onto her finger, a circle with no beginning and no end. And then, the moment the veil was lifted, Eliab's face appeared before hers, no longer a blurred shape, but clear and close, his eyes holding a mixture of awe, tenderness, and a shared breathless understanding. In that unveiled gaze, the last of her apprehension melted away. She was not losing herself. She was being joined to another, and in that joining, a new strength was being born. The feast that followed was a riot of laughter and music, tables groaning with food, and the air vibrating with the sheer, unadulterated joy of a community celebrating life and continuity. But for Martha, the most profound moment came later, as the stars began to prick the deep velvet of the night sky. She stood with Eliab at the door of the small, clean home he had built with his own hands, the house that was now theirs. The sounds of the celebration were a distant hum. He turned to her, his hand finding hers in the twilight. There were no grand words, only a quiet, shared look that spoke of a future waiting to be built, day by day, prayer by prayer. Inside, the air still smelled of fresh whitewash and the cedar wood of the roof beams. A single oil lamp cast a warm, golden pool of light in the main room, illuminating the grinding stone, the loom, the hearth, the instruments of her new domain. She looked at them not as burdens, but as tools. This was her sanctuary, the place where she would live out the vows she had made. Here she would weave not just cloth, but a legacy of faithfulness. Here she would grind grain into bread that would nourish not just bodies, but spirits. She felt a fierce, determined joy rise within her. This was her beginning. She was a wife, a keeper of a home, and she was resolved to build it upon the unshakable foundation of the faith that had carried Miriam through the reeds, Deborah to the battlefield, and Ruth to a foreign field. Her commitment was not a cage, but a cornerstone. Chapter 11. The Mother's Joy. The pain was a tempest, a roaring primal force that seized her body and threatened to shatter her spirit. For hours Martha had been lost in its rhythm, a relentless tide of pressure and searing intensity that stripped away all thought, all memory, leaving only the raw animal instinct to endure. The small lamplit room swam in and out of focus, the faces of the midwife and her own mother appearing as blurred, anxious moons in the shifting darkness. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the birthing stool, her cries tearing from a place so deep within it felt like her very soul was being rent in two. In the eye of the storm, a single terrifying thought echoed. She was coming undone, and she did not know if she would be remade. Then, as suddenly as it had consumed her, the storm broke. A final excruciating push, a sensation of tearing release, and a new sound pierced the thick, heavy air, a thin, indignant wail, fierce and alive. The sound was a hook, pulling Martha back from the precipice. The world rushed back in. The slick sweat on her skin, the metallic scent of blood, the midwife's murmurs of relieved praise. Her mother was weeping, pressing a cool cloth to her brow, and then they were placing the tiny swaddled bundle into her trembling, exhausted arms. The world narrowed to the space between her chest and the crook of her elbow. The baby's cries subsided into soft, hiccuping breaths. She was impossibly small, her face a crumpled rose petal, her head covered in a shock of dark, damp hair. Her eyes, two slits of deepest blue, blinked open for a fleeting moment, unfocused, yet profoundly aware. Martha's breath caught. All the pain, the fear, the long months of waiting dissolved into a single, overwhelming wave of a love so fierce it was almost painful. This was her daughter, a piece of her own soul now living and breathing outside her body. The joy that flooded her was a physical warmth, a radiance that started in her core and spread to her fingertips, healing the raw, torn places with its gentle, insistent light. The first days were a haze of wonder and profound exhaustion. Her body ached, a deep, bruised reminder of the battle it had fought and won. The baby, her daughter, needed her constantly, a tiny, demanding sovereign whose every whimper was a command. Sleep became a fragmented, precious commodity, stolen in brief snatches between feedings and soothing and the endless changing of cloths. There was a messy, shocking reality to it all, a far cry from the serene images of motherhood she had once held. Yet, in the deep quiet of the night, with the baby's warm weight nestled against her, a perfect, trusting bundle, Martha found a strength she never knew she possessed. It was a strength born of selflessness, a willingness to pour herself out completely for this new, fragile life. When the time came to name her, there was no hesitation. The stories that had shaped her, the songs of faith that had been her lullabies, now demanded a voice for the next generation. She looked at her daughter's face, at the determined set of her tiny jaw even in sleep, and she knew she would be called Miriam. It was a name that sang of water and deliverance, of a sister's quick wit and unwavering courage by the banks of the Nile. It was a name that carried the rhythm of a timbrel, the sound of women dancing in celebration of a miracle. In bestowing this name, Martha was weaving her daughter into the great tapestry, entrusting her with a legacy of faith and fortitude. One evening, as the soft twilight settled over the village and the baby fretted with a faint, restless cry, Martha began to hum. It was a wordless, wandering melody at first, a sound to match the gentle rocking of her body. Then, almost without conscious thought, words began to form, rising from the deep well of her heart. They were not a song she had been taught, but one being born in that moment, a mother's first gift to her child. It was a lullaby of hope, a quiet promise. Whispered into the shell of a tiny ear, she sang of a God who watched over them, of a future written in stars, of a love that would never falter. Her voice, though tired, was steady and sure, weaving a cocoon of safety and promise around the small listening form. As she sang, the baby's cries stilled, her breathing evening out into the soft, regular rhythm of sleep. And in that hushed, holy space, with her daughter's peaceful weight in her arms and the song of hope on her lips, Martha understood the true, boundless dimensions of a mother's joy. Chapter 12. The Shadow of Loss. The first cough was a small, dry sound, little more than a catch in the baby's breath as she slept nestled against Martha's side. In the deep quiet of the night, it was a pinprick of unease, easily soothed away with a gentle rock and a whispered prayer. But by morning, the sound had deepened, rattling in the tiny chest with a wet, ominous weight. Miriam's skin, usually so soft and cool, was now flushed with an unnatural heat, her small body a furnace against Martha's palm. The bright, curious light in her eyes had dimmed, replaced by a glassy, fevered lethargy that refused milk and turned away from the world. A cold, sharp dread, colder than any winter stream, closed around Martha's heart, squeezing the breath from her lungs. The shadow had fallen, swift and silent, and it was the shape of every mother's deepest fear. The hours that followed blurred into a single, agonizing vigil. Martha moved through the small house like a ghost, her entire being focused on the tiny, burning form in the cradle. She bathed the fevered skin with cool water from the well until her own arms ached. She crushed herbs, hyssop, and thyme into a poultice, her hands trembling as she pressed them to the child's chest. The sharp, clean scent a desperate prayer against the sickness. She tried to coax drops of water between the slack, listless lips, her own throat tight with unshed tears. With every ragged, struggling breath her daughter took, Martha felt her own hope fray a little more. The vibrant joy of just days before felt like a cruel, distant dream. In the terrifying silence between the baby's weak cries, the memory of another mother's desperate prayer surfaced in her mind. Hannah, barren and broken, pouring out her soul before the Lord at Shiloh, her lips moving in silent, fervent petition. Martha's own prayers became that same wordless, raw offering, a torrent of fear and faith warring in the quiet of the room. She was not alone in her watch. The news traveled through the village on hushed, sympathetic currents, and soon the women came. They did not come with loud lamentations or empty platitudes. They came with the quiet, practical resilience that was their birthright. Sarah, the young mother Martha had comforted months before, arrived with a jar of fresh goat's milk and took over the grinding of the day's grain without a word. An old widow, her own hands, gnarled with arthritis, sat in the corner and began to mend a torn tunic, her presence a steady, silent anchor. Another brought a basket of figs and simply sat, her eyes sharing the burden of Martha's fear. They moved around her, a sisterhood of solace, their shared understanding a fortress against the despair that threatened to consume her. They did not promise a miracle. They simply embodied the stubborn, enduring truth that no woman should face her darkest hour alone. For 2 days and 2 nights the shadow lingered, a pall over the household. Martha's faith felt thin, a frayed rope stretched to its breaking point. She clung to the memory of the women who had come before her, Jochebed trusting her son to the river, Esther walking toward a king's throne. Their faith had been a choice made in the face of overwhelming odds, and she chose again and again to make it hers. On the third morning, as a pale gray light filtered through the window, Martha rose from her knees, her body stiff and her spirit weary. She went to the cradle, her heart a leaden weight in her chest, expecting to find the same fevered struggle. But the heat was gone. She pressed her lips to the baby's forehead and felt only the blessed, normal warmth of healthy sleep. The rattling in the tiny chest had quieted, replaced by the soft, even rhythm of peaceful breathing. Miriam stirred, her eyes fluttering open. They were clear again, focused, and they looked directly at her mother. A small, weak hand reached up, fingers curling around Martha's. It was not a grip of desperation, but one of recognition, of reconnection. A sob, half relief, half praise, broke from Martha's lips. She gathered her daughter into her arms, holding the living, breathing answer to her desperate prayers. The shadow had not vanished. The memory of its chill would remain, but it had been pierced by a light that felt all the brighter for the darkness it had overcome. The women who had kept vigil with her smiled, their eyes glistening, and slipped quietly away, their work done. As Martha rocked her healed child, humming the lullaby of hope once more, she felt her faith, tested in the fire of fear, emerge not broken, but reforged, stronger and more certain than ever before. It was a faith that knew the reality of the shadow, but believed with every fiber of her being in the power of the dawn. Chapter 13. The Healer's Touch. The whispers arrived in Nazareth like seeds on the wind, carried by travelers and traders whose eyes held a new, unsettling light. They spoke of a man from Galilee, a teacher whose words carried authority, but it was his actions that set the village buzzing. He healed the blind, they said. He touched lepers and made them clean. And then came the story that caught in Martha's mind and refused to let go. A woman, they murmured, a woman who had been bleeding for 12 years, a walking source of ritual impurity, shunned and desperate. In a surging, desperate press of a crowd, she had not asked for his attention, had not demanded a public audience. She had simply reached out, her fingers brushing the fringe of his cloak as he passed, believing that even this fleeting, anonymous contact would be enough. And it was. The hemorrhage, a constant, draining shadow for over a decade, had ceased instantly. He had felt the power leave him, they said, and he had turned, not in anger, but to seek her out. He had called her daughter, and he had commended her faith. Martha turned this story over and over in her mind as she kneaded the day's bread, her hands working the dough with a familiar rhythmic pressure. It was the miracle itself that first captivated her, the raw, impossible power of it. But it was the aftermath that truly unsettled the quiet waters of her soul. He had sought her out. In a culture where a woman in her condition was meant to be invisible, a source of contamination to be avoided, he had stopped a moving crowd to find her. He had not chastised her for touching him, for making him, by the strictest interpretation of the law, ritually unclean. Instead, he had publicly affirmed her, restoring not just her physical health, but her dignity, her place in the community. He had called her daughter. The word echoed in Martha's heart, a radical declaration of value that seemed to rewrite the very rules of engagement between the divine and the feminine. That evening, as the last of the sun's warmth bled from the terracotta tiles of their roof, she found Eliab mending a broken yoke in the courtyard. The scent of cedar shavings and olive oil hung in the air. She sat beside him, the story of the bleeding woman resting on her tongue. She told it not as a distant rumor, but as a question, a key offered to a lock. She spoke of the healer's touch, of the power that could flow even from the hem of a garment, but most of all, she spoke of his respect, his deliberate public honoring of a woman everyone else would have crossed the street to avoid. Eliab listened, his strong, capable hands stilling their work. He was a good man, a righteous man who loved the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He had always treated Martha with a kindness that bordered on reverence, valuing her mind and her spirit. But the world he knew was ordered, its boundaries clear. "It is a great miracle," he agreed, his brow furrowed in thought, "a sign of God's great power. But, Martha, we must be cautious. The law is clear on matters of purity. For a man, a teacher no less, to be touched by such a woman, and to then call attention to it." He shook his head, not in dismissal, but in genuine struggle. "It challenges the traditions, the ways we have always understood holiness. Perhaps it was a singular moment, an exception for that one woman's great faith." His words were not spoken in anger, but they laid bare the chasm between the old understanding and the new unsettling possibility this healer represented. For Eliab, faith was lived within the sturdy, God-given fences of the law. For Martha, the story felt like a gate swinging open in one of those fences, revealing a wider, more merciful landscape beyond. "But he called her daughter," she repeated softly, her voice insistent. "He did not see her as a breach of the law, but as a child of God. He valued her initiative, her faith, above the rules that had cast her out. Does that not tell us something about the heart of God? That He values the person, the faith, above the ritual?" The debate that unfolded between them there in the gathering twilight was quiet, a tender tension of love and deeply held conviction. Eliab spoke of the importance of order, of the law as a guardian of the people. Martha spoke of compassion, of a righteousness that seemed to exceed that of the scribes and Pharisees. They did not resolve the matter. The mystery of the Nazarene healer was too new, too vast. But as the first stars pricked the deep blue of the sky, Eliab reached out and covered her hand with his calloused palm warm and familiar. "Your heart for this is good, Martha," he said, his voice gentle. "It is a puzzle worth pondering." And ponder it she did. Long after Eliab had fallen asleep, Martha lay awake, the image of the healed woman burning in her mind. It was more than a story of a miracle. It was a declaration of a new kind of equality, a radical inclusion that flowed from the healer's touch. It suggested that in the economy of God, a woman's faith could be as potent as a man's, her wholeness as divinely important, her silent, desperate reach for grace as worthy of recognition as any public prayer. The healer had not just restored a body, he had affirmed a soul, and in doing so, he had touched something deep within Martha, stirring a hope she had not known she was waiting for. Chapter 14. The Teacher's Disciple. The woman who arrived in Nazareth seemed to carry a new kind of light within her, a quiet radiance that had nothing to do with the sun. Her name was Joanna, and she was from the household of Chuza, Herod's steward. A woman of some standing, yet her demeanor held no haughtiness, only a profound, settled peace that drew Martha like a moth to a lamp. She had come to visit relatives, and word quickly spread through the women's circles that she had been there in the crowds that followed the teacher from Galilee. She had heard him speak, had seen his works, and had herself become one of his disciples. Martha found a way to be near her, offering help with the preparations for the Sabbath meal at her relative's home. As they rolled out dough and chopped herbs, Joanna spoke, her voice low and melodic, not with the rehearsed tone of a storyteller, but with the fresh, awestruck wonder of an eyewitness. She spoke of his words, how they felt like cool water on a parched soul, how he spoke of a kingdom not of palaces and armies, but of the heart, a kingdom where the poor in spirit and the pure in heart were blessed. But it was when she spoke of the other women who traveled with him that Martha's hands stilled completely. She spoke of Mary from Magdala, a woman from whom he had cast out 7 demons. Joanna's voice softened with a deep respect as she described Mary's devotion, a loyalty forged in the fires of her own deliverance. Mary followed him not out of mere curiosity, but with a gratitude so vast it had reoriented her entire life. She, along with Joanna and Susanna and many others, supported his ministry from their own means, a sisterhood of faith walking the dusty roads of Galilee alongside the 12. This image struck Martha with the force of a revelation. These women were not passive listeners on the fringes of the crowd. They were participants, partners in the work. They were disciples in the truest sense, learners, followers, supporters. Mary Magdalene's story in particular resonated deeply. She was a woman who had been broken and then made whole. Her past not a source of shame, but a testimony to the transformative power she now followed. Her devotion was not quiet or hidden. It was active, costly, and public. This was a new model of faithfulness, one that combined the listening heart of Mary of Bethany with the decisive action of Deborah, all centered on this one compelling teacher. A hunger, different from the one that had driven her to the Scriptures after hearing of Huldah, awoke within Martha. It was a hunger for living knowledge, for a faith that was not just studied from scrolls, but breathed in the company of others who were also seeking. The stories of the heroines of old had been her foundation, but the testimony of Joanna and the example of Mary Magdalene felt like the walls and roof of a faith she could actually inhabit. She wanted to understand these teachings for herself, to grapple with their meaning, to feel the same transformative power that had reordered Mary's life. She began to ask discreet questions among the women of Nazareth, probing to see if others felt this same stirring. To her surprise, she found them. A small group of women, mostly younger wives and mothers like herself, had been meeting in the home of a widow named Judith to discuss the prophecies and the strange, hopeful rumors swirling around the teacher from Nazareth. They were cautious, knowing such gatherings could draw suspicion, but their desire for understanding outweighed their fear. The following week, with Eliab's cautious but trusting blessing, Martha walked to Judith's home as the evening stars began to appear. The room was simple, lit by a single oil lamp, its light pooling on the intent faces of the half-dozen women gathered there. Judith, her hair silvered but her eyes bright with intelligence, unrolled a small scroll of Isaiah. They did not just listen. They discussed. They wrestled with the words, comparing them to the things Joanna had reported, sharing their own questions and hopes. They spoke of the kingdom he preached, of what it meant to love one's enemy, of the blessedness of the meek. Martha sat among them, her heart feeling as though it were expanding in her chest. This was different from the debates with Rebecca or the theoretical discussions with Eliab. This was a shared pursuit, a collective leaning into a mystery. She added her voice to the conversation, sharing the story of the bleeding woman and what it had taught her about value and faith. The other women listened, their nods and thoughtful murmurs a form of affirmation she had rarely known. In that lamp-lit room, surrounded by seeking hearts, Martha felt a piece of her own spirit click into place. She was no longer just a keeper of a household or a listener to tales. She was a student, a seeker of spiritual knowledge, joining her thread to a new and vibrant tapestry of faith that was being woven right before her eyes. One searching question, one shared insight at a time. Chapter 15, The Crossroads. The news arrived like a shattering of the world itself, carried not by joyful proclamation, but on the broken, disbelieving whispers of travelers whose faces were etched with a grief too profound for tears. The teacher, Jesus of Nazareth, the one who spoke with such authority and healed with such compassion, had been crucified. The words were a physical blow, knocking the breath from Martha's lungs and leaving a cold, hollow ache in the pit of her stomach. She stood frozen in her courtyard, the water jar she had been about to lift forgotten at her feet, its contents seeping darkly into the dry earth. The hope that had been growing in her heart, nurtured by Joanna's testimony and the gatherings in Judith's home, withered in an instant, replaced by a crushing wave of despair. Crucified, the most shameful, agonizing death the Romans could devise, the kingdom of the heart, the blessedness of the meek, it had all ended on a Roman cross, a testament not to God's power, but to the world's brutal, unyielding strength. The following day was a Sabbath of shadows. The familiar rituals of rest felt like a mockery. The prayers stuck in her throat, the psalms of deliverance tasting of ash. She moved through the small, silent spaces of her home, the image of the cross burning behind her eyes. She thought of Mary Magdalene, whose whole life had been re-centered on him, and of Joanna, who had left her comfortable life to follow. What were they feeling now? What shattered landscape did they inhabit? The vibrant tapestry of faith she had felt herself joining now seemed like a beautiful, fragile web torn to pieces by a single, brutal act. Eliab watched her, his own face heavy with a confused sorrow, but he had no words of comfort that could bridge the chasm of her disillusionment. The teacher's radical message, his challenge to tradition, had seemingly ended where all such challenges ended, in blood and dust. But then, on the third day, a different kind of whisper began to circulate, a fragile, bewildered counter-melody to the dirge of despair. It started with the women, of course. Mary Magdalene, Joanna, and Mary, the mother of James, had gone to the tomb at first light, their hearts leaden with grief, carrying spices to anoint a corpse. They had found the stone rolled away and the tomb empty. And then they claimed they had seen angels, and then they claimed they had seen him, alive, risen. The reports were fragmented, breathless, dismissed by the men as the hysterical ravings of women overwhelmed by grief. But Martha, hearing the fragmented accounts from a neighbor who had heard it from a cousin in Jerusalem, felt a strange, defiant spark ignite in the cold ashes of her heart. She remembered the bleeding woman whose faith had drawn power from the mere fringe of his garment. She remembered the unwavering devotion of Mary Magdalene, a woman who had known the depths of darkness and had been pulled into the light. These were not foolish women. These were witnesses. Their testimony, however dismissed by others, carried a weight of personal integrity that Martha could not ignore. She thought of Sarah laughing at God's impossible promise, of the women at the tomb being the first to witness its fulfillment. It was always the women who were there, at the beginning and the end, their faith often preceding understanding. That evening, she walked alone to the outskirts of the village, the setting sun painting the sky in shades of violet and gold. She stood at a literal crossroads, where the path to her home met the wider road that led to Jerusalem and the world beyond. The choice before her was as stark as the diverging paths. One way led back to the safe, familiar world of quiet duty and managed expectations, a world where the cross was the final, terrible word. The other way led toward a wild, unbelievable hope, a story of an empty tomb and a risen teacher, a path paved on the testimony of women that the world called nonsense. The wind, warm and scented with time, tugged at her shawl. She looked down the road toward Jerusalem, the city of kings and prophets, of temples and tombs. Despair was a heavy cloak, familiar and seductive in its certainty, but hope was a fragile, fluttering bird in her chest, a thing that required a decision, a step of faith into the unknown. The stories of her foremothers rose within her, Miriam's step from the reeds, Ruth's journey to a foreign field, Esther's uninvited approach to the king. They had all stood at a crossroads, and they had all chosen the path of risk, the path of faith. Martha took a deep, shuddering breath, the cool evening air filling her lungs. She would not let the world's dismissal silence the witness of the women. She would not let despair be the final word. The spark of hope, fanned by the breath of their testimony, grew into a small, steady flame. She turned her back on the path of quiet resignation and faced the road to Jerusalem, not knowing what she would find, but knowing with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that she had to go. She had to see for herself, to listen, to learn. She would explore this new, impossible, terrifying, and glorious faith. The decision was made. At the crossroads, Martha chose to believe the women. Chapter 16. The empty tomb. The road to Jerusalem was a pilgrimage of trembling hope. Every step Martha took was a prayer, a silent plea that the wild, impossible stories whispered by the women might be true. The city, when she reached it, was a cauldron of conflicting emotions. The lingering shock of the execution, the hushed, fervent debates in the narrow streets, and beneath it all, a current of something new, something electric and fragile. She found her way to the home where many of his followers had gathered, the air thick with a mixture of fear, confusion, and a dawning, bewildered joy. And it was there, in a sunlit courtyard surrounded by anxious faces, that she heard the account firsthand. The woman speaking was Mary of Magdala. Her face, once haunted by 7 demons, now shone with a clarity so profound it seemed to illuminate the very space around her. She spoke not with the hysterical grief others had dismissed, but with a calm, unshakable certainty that held the entire room captive. She described the pre-dawn journey to the tomb, the heavy spices in her hands, the leaden weight of a grief so complete it felt like a physical death. She described the shock of seeing the great stone rolled away, the frantic rush into the cool, dark cavity, the terrifying, heart-stopping emptiness where a body should have been. Panic had been their first response, a belief that the final indignity had been committed, the theft of his corpse. But then, Mary said, her voice dropping to a reverent whisper, there had been the light. 2 men in clothes that gleamed like lightning, their presence filling the tomb with an unearthly radiance. The women had fallen to the ground, faces in the dust, paralyzed by a terror beyond any they had known, and the men had spoken, their words not of condemnation, but of gentle, earth-shattering rebuke. Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here. He has risen. They had reminded them of his own words, the prophecy they had been too grief-stricken to understand. And then the men were gone, leaving only the echo of their message and the profound ringing silence of the empty tomb. Mary's story did not end there. Through a veil of tears, disbelieving and desperate, she had lingered outside the tomb after the others had fled. And it was there, in the gray light of the new dawn, that she had seen him. At first, she thought he was the gardener, her vision blurred by sorrow. But then he had spoken her name, just one word, Mary. But in that single utterance was the entirety of her deliverance, her past, her future, all the love and power that had remade her. It was him, alive, not a ghost, not a vision, but the teacher himself, standing before her in a body that was both familiar and gloriously new, the very seal of death broken and cast aside. As Martha listened, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. The careful, ordered universe of law and tradition, of cause and effect, of the finality of the grave, dissolved in the face of this testimony. The empty tomb was not a symbol of loss, but the epicenter of a cosmic victory. The resurrection was not a theological concept. It was a historical event witnessed by a woman whose credibility Martha would stake her very life upon. In that moment, something fractured and fell away inside her, the last vestiges of doubt, the final chains of fear. A brilliant, unquenchable light flooded her soul, igniting a belief that was more solid and real than the stone walls around her. This was the ultimate revelation, the final, glorious answer to every story of deliverance she had ever cherished. The God of Sarah's laughter, of Miriam's song, of Deborah's victory, was the God who had conquered death itself, and he had chosen a woman to be the first herald of this impossible, world-altering hope. Chapter 17. The Upper Room. The invitation came as a soft knock at dusk. A coded signal passed from one seeking heart to another. The air in Jerusalem still thrummed with the political tension of the recent Passover, but beneath the city's anxious surface, a different, quieter current was flowing. Martha followed her guide through a labyrinth of narrow, shadowed streets, the fading light painting the limestone walls in shades of gold and violet. They stopped before an unassuming door, and a hushed password was exchanged before it swung inward. The room she entered was large, occupying the entire upper floor of a wealthy believer's home, and it was filled with a soft, murmuring energy. Lamplight flickered across intent faces, men and women, young and old, sitting together on woven mats. This was no secret rebellion, but a gathering of the way, a community bound not by blood, but by a shared electrifying belief in the risen Christ. The meeting began not with a sermon from a man, but with a testimony from a woman named Lydia, a dealer in purple cloth from Thyatira. She spoke of Priscilla, a tent maker like her husband Aquila, and how this remarkable woman had taken aside the eloquent and learned Apollos in Ephesus. Priscilla had explained the way of God to him more adequately, gently correcting his understanding and deepening his faith. A woman teaching a renowned scholar. The fact was stated simply, without fanfare, as if it were the most natural thing in the world in this new kingdom. Then a young mother stood and shared how the women in her house church gathered regularly to pray, their intercessions rising like incense, their faith a tangible force in their lives and community. In this upper room, the stories Martha had cherished of Deborah's leadership and Hulda's prophecy were not ancient history. They were living practice, The Spirit was being poured out on all flesh, and here daughters were prophesying just as the prophet Joel had foretold. As she listened, a strange and powerful sensation bloomed within Martha's chest, a feeling both terrifying and exhilarating. It was a pull, a gentle but insistent tug on her spirit, as tangible as a hand on her shoulder. It was a call to participate, to move from the safe periphery of listening into the vulnerable center of sharing. The prayers of the women, the teaching of Priscilla, the testimony of Mary Magdalene, they were not just examples to be admired from a distance. They were an invitation. The faith that had carried her from a clay jar in a Judean village to this lamplit room in Jerusalem was not meant to be a private treasure. It was a gift to be unfolded, a voice to be added to the chorus. The familiar weight of duty was still there, but it had been transformed. It was no longer a burden of silent expectation, but a charge of active partnership. The leader of the gathering, a gentle-eyed man named Stephen, invited others to lead in prayer. One by one, voices rose, a prayer for the sick, a prayer for the persecuted, a prayer of thanksgiving for the grace that had found them. With each spoken Amen, the pull within Martha grew stronger, a rising tide she could no longer contain. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of fear and conviction. She thought of her daughter Miriam sleeping safely in a friend's home, and of the legacy of faith she was determined to pass on. She thought of the silent strength of her own mother and the boldness of the prophetesses. This was her moment to weave her thread into the living tapestry. When a space of silence fell, Martha found herself rising to her feet. The eyes of the room turned toward her, not with judgment, but with quiet expectation. For a breathless second, the words stuck in her throat, choked by a lifetime of being taught that a woman's voice was best kept soft and private. But then she looked at the faces around her, the encouraging nod of an elderly sister, the hopeful gaze of a young girl, and she felt the presence of the Spirit, a warm, sustaining wind filling her lungs. She closed her eyes, shutting out everything but the connection between her heart and heaven. Her voice, when it came, was low at first, a tremulous stream finding its bed. She did not offer a practiced formal prayer, but the honest overflow of her journey. She gave thanks for the water jars and the grinding stones that had taught her endurance, for the grandmother's tales that had ignited her courage, for the healer's touch that had affirmed her worth. She prayed for her husband Eliab, that his steadfast heart would continue to grow in this new understanding. She prayed for her daughter, that little Miriam would know a world where her faith could flourish without constraint. She prayed for this community, this family of the way, that they would be bold in love and unwavering in truth. As she spoke, her voice grew stronger, steadier, the words flowing not from her mind, but from the deep, faithful well of her spirit. It was a prayer of gratitude, of dedication, of a life being fully, finally offered up. When she whispered, Amen, and opened her eyes, the silence in the room was different. It was a silence of shared peace, of a sacred moment acknowledged. She had led them. She had given voice to their collective heart, and in doing so, Martha, the girl from Nazareth, had fully become Martha, a disciple of Christ. Chapter 18. The journey ahead. The decision hung in the air of their small home, as tangible and divisive as a drawn sword. The stories from Jerusalem were no longer distant rumors. They were a call to action, a summons to a new way of being that threatened the old, comfortable foundations of their village life. Eliab sat by the cold hearth, his strong carpenter's hands clasped tightly, his face a landscape of conflict. To openly align with the way, this burgeoning sect that proclaimed a crucified man as the Messiah, was to invite suspicion, ostracism, and perhaps even danger. The traditionalists in the village, led by the stern-faced elder Ezra, saw it as a dangerous heresy, a rejection of the law and the traditions that had sustained their people for generations. Their opposition was not merely theological. It was a wall of social pressure, a threat of becoming outcasts in the only community they had ever known. Martha watched the struggle on her husband's face, her own heart a battlefield of fear and of fierce newfound conviction. The peace of the upper room, the power of the shared prayers, the testimony of the resurrection, these were not things she could unknow or unlive. They had rewired her soul. She saw the fear in his eyes, the very real concern for their safety, for their daughter's future, but she also saw the flicker of the same belief that had ignited in her, the same hope that had drawn him to listen, to ponder. She knew this was not a moment for silent submission, for the quiet strength of the grinding stone. This was a moment for the courage of Deborah, for the decisive action of Esther. This was her moment to lead. She moved from her place and knelt before him, not in supplication, but in partnership, her hands covering his. Her voice, when she spoke, was low and fervent, a river of passion forged in the fires of her journey. She did not speak in abstract theology, but in the language of their life. She spoke of the healer who had valued a woman's touch, of the teacher who had included women as disciples of the risen Lord who had first appeared to a woman. She painted a picture not of rebellion, but of fulfillment. The stories of Miriam, Ruth, and Huldah were not being discarded, she argued, but were being brought to their glorious ultimate conclusion in this new covenant. This was the redemption song they had been waiting for, the hope that made sense of every silent strength and every desperate prayer. To turn away now, out of fear, would be to deny the very thread of faithfulness that connected them to their mothers and their mothers' mothers. Her words were not an attack, but an unveiling. She spoke of the community they had found in Jerusalem, a family bound by a love that transcended blood and tradition, a place where her voice in prayer was heard and where a woman like Priscilla could teach. She spoke of the need for a safe place to grow in this faith, a place where little Miriam could be raised not in the shadow of suspicion, but in the light of this liberating truth. Her advocacy was a tapestry, weaving together scripture, personal testimony, and a mother's fierce hope for her child's future. She was no longer just a follower. She was a visionary, casting a picture of a life of greater purpose and profounder peace, even if it meant leaving everything familiar behind. Eliab looked into her eyes, and he saw not the apprehensive girl he had betrothed, but a woman of unshakable faith and startling clarity. The wall of his resistance, built of duty and fear, crumbled before the force of her love and her logic. He saw the truth in her words, the echo of the hope that had stirred in his own heart. The safety of the village was an illusion if it meant suffocating the spirit. The journey ahead was fraught with uncertainty, but the destination she painted, a life of authentic faith, of community, of spiritual freedom, was a prize worth any risk. He squeezed her hands, a single, decisive gesture. The conflict in his eyes resolved into a calm, resolute determination. They would go. They would gather their few possessions, take their daughter, and leave Nazareth under the cover of the next moonless night. They would travel to a larger city, a place like Joppa or Caesarea, where the community of the way was stronger, where they could live and worship without the constant pressure of hostile eyes. It was a terrifying leap into the unknown, a plot point that would redefine the entire trajectory of their lives. But as Martha looked at her husband's transformed face, she felt a profound peace settle over her. The journey ahead was not a path of exile, but a pilgrimage toward a promised land of the Spirit, and they would walk it together, their faith a lamp unto their feet and a light unto their path. Chapter 19. The Weaver of Tents. The city was a cacophony of new sounds and smells, the cry of gulls over the harbor, the tang of salt and fish, the clamor of merchants haggling in a dozen different tongues. Their new home in the bustling port of Corinth was a world away from the quiet, sun-baked rhythms of Nazareth. The fear of the journey had been real, a cold companion on the moonless roads, but it had been eclipsed by the warmth of the welcome they found. The community of the way here was a vibrant, breathing organism, a tapestry of Jews and Greeks, slaves and freedmen, all woven together by a shared revolutionary faith. And at the heart of this fledgling church were two people who would become the anchor of Martha's new life, Priscilla and Aquila. They were tent makers by trade, and their workshop became a sanctuary. The air was thick with the honest scent of cured leather and goat's hair, a practical, earthy fragrance that grounded the lofty truths discussed within. Martha first met them when Eliab, seeking work, brought his carpentry skills to their shop. She had come along, little Miriam balanced on her hip, and had been immediately struck by the dynamic between the couple. They moved in a seamless, silent partnership, their hands skilled and sure as they cut and stitched the tough fabrics. Aquila was a man of quiet strength, his eyes kind, but it was Priscilla who commanded Martha's attention. She was a woman perhaps a decade older, her face lined with intelligence and a calm authority. She did not defer to her husband. She worked alongside him as an equal, her mind as sharp and precise as her needle. As the days turned into weeks, Martha and Eliab spent more time in the workshop, the rhythmic sounds of their labors becoming a backdrop for deep and transformative conversations. Priscilla, while stitching a seam or treating a hide, would explain the scriptures, showing how the law and the prophets pointed directly to Jesus as the promised Messiah. She spoke with a clarity and depth that mesmerized Martha. This was not the dry recitation of a scribe, but the living, breathing application of God's Word, illuminated by the Spirit. She and Aquila were a team not just in business, but in ministry. They hosted a church in their home, and Martha soon learned that Priscilla was a teacher respected by all. The story Lydia had told in the upper room was not an isolated incident. Here was a woman who regularly explained the way of God to both men and women, her authority rooted not in a title, but in her profound understanding and the evident anointing upon her life. Watching them, a new and powerful understanding dawned on Martha. The dichotomy she had once felt between the silent domestic strength of her mother and the public, prophetic roles of women like Deborah began to dissolve in the dusty, sunlit space of the tent-maker's shop. Here, faith and work were not separate realms. The very act of weaving a tent, of creating a shelter from the elements, became a metaphor for building the church, for creating a spiritual home for believers. Priscilla's ministry was not something she did apart from her daily life. It flowed through it. Her teaching was as integral to her identity as her skill with a needle. This was collaboration in its purest form, a marriage, a business, and a ministry all functioning as one harmonious whole, a living testament to how the gospel elevated every aspect of human endeavor. Martha found herself profoundly encouraged. Her own life, which had felt so small and confined in Nazareth, now seemed brimming with new potential. The skills she possessed, managing a household, nurturing a family, offering quiet comfort, were not lesser than the gift of teaching. They were different threads in the same grand design. In Priscilla, she saw a woman who had fully integrated her faith into her work and her relationships, whose influence was profound precisely because it was rooted in the practical, loving service of crafting shelters and building up souls. The weaver of tents was also a weaver of hearts, and Martha, watching her, understood that her own calling, whatever form it took, was to do the same, to collaborate with God and her community, stitching her own unique thread of faithfulness into the ever-expanding glorious tapestry of the way. Chapter 20. The Letters of Hope. The arrival of a traveler from the church in Rome was an event that sent a ripple of anticipation through the community in Corinth. He carried with him not goods or news of the empire, but something far more precious, a scroll, a letter from the Apostle Paul. The gathering that night in the home of Priscilla and Aquila was charged with a quiet electricity, the air thick with the scent of lamp oil and eager expectation. The reader, a young man with a clear, resonant voice, began to unroll the parchment, and the words, penned in distant lands, filled the room with the weight of apostolic authority and pastoral love. He spoke of grace, of faith, of the unity of the body of Christ. And then he read a list of names, a roll call of the saints who were to be greeted. Among them, like a sudden bright star in a familiar constellation, was a woman's name, Phoebe, a deacon of the church in Cenchreae, for she has been a benefactor of many people, including me. The words landed in Martha's heart with the force of a divine affirmation. Phoebe, a deacon, a woman entrusted with responsibility, with leadership, her service and generosity acknowledged by Paul himself in this letter that would be read aloud in churches across the known world. It was not just a mention. It was a public endorsement, a seal of legitimacy on the active, official ministry of a woman within the fledgling church. The stories of Deborah and Huldah, which had once felt like ancient singular exceptions, now felt like a precedent being fulfilled. The quiet work of Priscilla, teaching in her home and her workshop, was here being echoed in the public recognition of another sister. In that moment, every thread of Martha's journey seemed to pull taut and sing with a single, clear note of purpose. The healer who valued women, the teacher who included them as disciples, the risen Lord who appeared to them first, and now the apostle who named them as leaders. It was a consistent, unbroken line of divine intent. Her faith was not a secondary supportive element in the grand story. It was a central, vital thread, affirmed and called to action. A New confidence, solid and unshakable, settled within her. It was a confidence born not of pride, but of a profound sense of belonging and purpose. The teachings she had absorbed in Judith's home, the prayers she had led in the upper room, the lessons she had learned from Priscilla, they were no longer just for her own edification. They were a well from which she was now compelled to draw for others. She began, quietly at first, to gather the younger women of the Corinthian church, those who were new to the faith or struggling with its implications in their daily lives. They met in her own small home, the space fragrant with the simple meal she had prepared. She did not set herself up as a scholar, but as a fellow traveler, a sister who had wrestled with the same questions. She shared the story of the bleeding woman, explaining how it had taught her about a faith that takes initiative. She spoke of the resurrection morning, emphasizing the pivotal role of the women as the first evangelists. She used the stories of the Hebrew Scriptures not as distant tales, but as living mirrors for their own lives, showing them how their faithfulness in the mundane, in their marriages, with their children, in their friendships, was a powerful form of discipleship. One woman in particular, a young Greek convert named Damaris, was struggling. She felt torn between the liberating message of Christ and the expectations of her traditional family, who saw her new faith as a rejection of her heritage. Martha saw the conflict in her eyes, the same restless anxiety she had once felt before her own betrothal. After the others had left, Martha sat with Damaris, listening to her fears without judgment. She thought of the letters of hope circulating among the churches, words of encouragement meant to strengthen the saints in the face of doubt and persecution. Later that evening, after Eliab and Miriam were asleep, Martha lit a small lamp and unrolled a piece of precious papyrus. The flickering light danced across the surface as she dipped a stylus into a pot of ink. She did not write a theological treatise. She wrote a letter of encouragement, a personal echo of the apostolic missives that were binding the church together. She wrote of her own journey, of the weight of the clay jar and the solace of the storyteller's fire. She reminded Damaris of Ruth, a foreigner who found her place in the lineage of the Messiah through her loyal love. She assured her that her faith was not a rejection of her family, but the fulfillment of a deeper, eternal belonging. Her words were simple, heartfelt, and grounded in the shared experience of womanhood and faith. She wrote of the silent strength they were called to embody, a strength that could, like Priscilla's, become a foundation for teaching and, like Phoebe's, a recognized service to the entire church. She sealed the letter with a drop of wax, a small tangible token of hope meant to fortify a wavering spirit. In that quiet act, Martha moved from being a learner to a teacher, from a receiver of hope to a bearer of it, her own life becoming a living letter written not with ink, but with the Spirit of the living God. Chapter 21. The Community of Faith. The small house, nestled in a quiet quarter of Corinth, had become a sanctuary. Its walls, once silent witnesses to a family's private life, now echoed with the soft murmur of prayers, the gentle strum of a lyre, and the shared sustaining breath of a community bound by a common hope. Martha moved among them, her hands no longer just shaping bread or mending cloth, but now also offering a steadying grip to a trembling widow, a cool cup of water to a fretful orphan, and a scroll of comfort to a heart heavy with doubt. This was the house church she helped Priscilla to lead, a living body where the teachings of the way were made tangible in acts of love. Here, the widows, often invisible in the wider world, found a place of honor and practical support. The orphans, vulnerable and adrift, were gathered into the embrace of a new extended family. In their grateful eyes and their growing faith, Martha saw the profound, quiet impact of women's faithfulness. It was a different kind of leadership, one woven from compassion and presence, a testament that the strength of the community was measured by its care for the most fragile among them. But even in this haven, the old human tensions could arise. The conflict began subtly, a fissure in the unity they so cherished. It was between two well-meaning believers, Barnabas, a gentle older man who had given generously to the common fund, and Eustace, a younger, zealous convert from a Greek background who was passionate about evangelism. The issue was the distribution of their meager resources. Barnabas, with the cautious heart of age, advocated for conserving their funds, for building a secure foundation for the community before venturing into wider missionary work. He saw the daily needs of the widows and orphans as the primary sacred charge. Eustace, burning with the fire of newfound faith, argued passionately that they were hoarding the light under a basket. He believed more funds should be allocated to sending out preachers, to printing small scrolls of the gospel, to reaching the lost in the city's darkest corners. He saw the Great Commission as an urgent command that outweighed immediate physical concerns. The disagreement, once a quiet debate, began to poison the well of their fellowship. Sides were tacitly taken. The communal meals grew quieter, the prayers more strained. Martha felt the discord like a chill in the air, a threat to the fragile ecosystem of love they had cultivated. She watched Barnabas grow more withdrawn, his generosity curdling into a sense of being unappreciated. She saw Eustace's zeal hardening into impatience, his passion for souls blinding him to the souls right beside him. The community was fracturing along the fault line of two different yet equally valid expressions of love. Priscilla, with her keen discernment, saw the danger, but it was Martha who felt called to step into the breach. She understood the language of both men. She knew the sacred weight of the daily grind, the holiness of providing for one's own household of faith. And she also carried the fire of the resurrection morning, the desperate need to share the good news. One evening, after the tensions had simmered through another gathering, she did not go home. Instead, she asked Barnabas and Eustace to remain. She did not summon them to a formal council, but invited them to sit with her in the lamp-lit main room, the very space where they broke bread together. She began not with accusation or theology, but with a story. She spoke of the early days in Jerusalem, of how the Hellenistic widows had felt neglected in the daily distribution, and how the apostles had appointed deacons to ensure that both the ministry of the word and the service of tables were honored. She painted a picture of a body where every part was essential. The hand could not say to the foot, "I have no need of you." Then she turned to Barnabas, her voice soft with respect. She affirmed his profound fatherly love for the community, his wisdom in building a stable foundation. She called it the ministry of Jochebed, the hidden, nurturing strength that protected the vulnerable. Then she turned to Eustace, her eyes alight with shared passion. She praised his fiery heart for the lost, his desire to see the kingdom expand. She called it the courage of Esther, the willingness to risk for the salvation of others. But a body, she said, her gaze holding them both, cannot be all heart or all hands. It must work together. She proposed a simple, practical mediation. They would create a small council, with Barnabas overseeing the care for the widows and orphans, ensuring their needs were met with wisdom and love. And they would appoint Eustace to lead a new outreach effort, but with a budget agreed upon by the council, a portion of the funds dedicated solely to spreading the word. It was not a victory for one side over the other, but a synthesis, a recognition that faithful stewardship and passionate evangelism were two sides of the same coin, both essential to the health of the whole. In the quiet that followed, the hard lines on their faces began to soften. Barnabas saw in Eustace not a reckless youth, but a son in the faith with a vital gift. Eustace saw in Barnabas not an obstacle, but a spiritual father providing the stable ground from which he could launch. The mediation, born from Martha's intuitive understanding and quiet authority, had not just solved a practical problem, it had repaired a breach in the spirit. As the two men nodded, a tentative peace settling between them, Martha felt a deep, humbling gratitude. This was the community of faith, not a perfect conflict-free paradise, but a living, breathing body learning to love, to forgive, and to weave its disparate threads into a single, beautiful, and enduring tapestry of grace. Chapter 22, The Persecution's Fire. The first sign was the silence, the familiar, friendly sounds of the marketplace, the chatter of neighbors, the laughter of children, the rhythmic clang of Eliab's hammer from his workshop, were swallowed by a tense, watchful hush. Then came the rumors slithering through the narrow streets of Corinth like venomous serpents, whispers of imperial edicts, of arrests in Rome, of followers of the way being dragged from their homes and thrown into prisons or worse. The air, once thick with the salt of the sea and the promise of a new beginning, now carried the acrid scent of fear. The persecution, which had been a distant story from the capital, had arrived at their doorstep, its cold breath frosting the windows of their faith. The threat became terrifyingly personal when a group of hostile men, their faces hard with zealous conviction, gathered outside the home of Jason, one of the leaders of their house church. Their shouts were a jagged cacophony of accusation. Traitors to the gods, disturbers of the peace, followers of a crucified criminal. That echoed through the quarter. Stones were thrown, shattering a clay oil jar by the door, a violent promise of what was to come. Martha, watching from a shadowed alley with Miriam clutched tightly to her side, felt a cold dread seize her heart. This was no longer a theoretical danger, it was a fire, and it was licking at the edges of their lives. Eliab's workshop was a known gathering place. Their own home was next. The safety they had journeyed so far to find was an illusion, shattered by the rising tide of hatred. That night, in the desperate quiet of their home, the fear was a palpable presence, a third occupant in the room. Eliab's face was ashen, his hands clenched into fists of helpless frustration. Little Miriam, sensing the terror of the adults, whimpered in her sleep. The urge to flee, to hide, to renounce everything to save their family was a powerful, seductive whisper in Martha's ear. But as she looked at her daughter's face, so innocent and trusting, and then at her husband's etched with a fear she had never seen before, a different fire began to kindle within her, a fire of remembrance. Her mind did not turn to strategies of escape, but to the stories that were the bedrock of her soul. She thought of the Hebrew midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, who had defied the Pharaoh's genocidal decree, their fear of God outweighing their fear of a king. They had hidden the newborn boys, their quiet rebellion a shield for the future of a nation. She saw, clear as lamplight, Rahab the prostitute in the wall of Jericho, her house a marked place of sanctuary. She had not cowered. She had acted, hiding the Israelite spies beneath the flax on her roof, her faith a scarlet thread of hope in a city doomed for destruction. And she remembered Jochebed, her own ancient namesake, who had hidden her son for 3 long months, her every sense heightened to the sound of soldiers' footsteps, her courage a desperate, loving fortress. These women had not been spared the pressure. They had been forged by it. Their steadfastness was not the absence of fear, but the choice to act faithfully in the very heart of it. The memories were a trumpet call to her spirit, drowning out the whisper of despair. Her fear did not vanish, but it was met and matched by a resolve as hard as Corinthian bronze. She looked at Eliab, her own eyes now clear and steady. "We will not run," she said, her voice low but unwavering. "We will do what the midwives did, what Rahab did." She laid out a plan, her thoughts sharp and clear. Their home, like Rahab's, would become a hiding place. The small windowless storage room at the back, used for grain and tools, could be concealed behind a false wall of stacked lumber from Eliab's workshop. They would prepare food and water, and they would get word to the most vulnerable among their community, the widows, the newly baptized, those with Roman targets on their backs. In the dead of that night, while the city slept its fitful sleep, they worked. Eliab's carpenter's hands, which usually crafted tables and yokes, now built a secret sanctuary. Martha and Miriam bundled dried figs, olives, and skins of water, their movements silent and purposeful. The stories of the biblical women were no longer tales of a distant past. They were a manual for survival, a blueprint for courage. When the first frantic knock came just before dawn, a young believer named Silas, his face bleeding from a thrown stone, they were ready. They pulled aside the cleverly constructed facade and ushered him into the dark, cramped space. He was followed by an elderly widow named Persis, trembling so violently she could barely walk, and then by a whole family, their eyes wide with terror. Martha moved among them in the gloom, her presence a calm center in their storm. She passed around the water, whispered words of the Psalms, and pressed a cool cloth to Silas's brow. The air in the hidden room was close, thick with the smell of fear and sweat and faith. Outside, they could hear the occasional shout, the pounding of a distant door, the chilling evidence of the persecution's fire raging through their city. But inside, within the walls fortified by the memory of courageous women, a different fire burned, the steady, enduring flame of steadfastness under pressure. Martha, her back against the grain sacks, her daughter asleep in her lap, and her hand resting on the trembling shoulder of old Persis, knew this was her moment. This was her Nile, her wall of Jericho, and she would not be moved. Chapter 23. The Legacy of Love. The years had softened the sharp edges of fear, smoothing them into the gentle contours of memory. The fire of persecution had eventually banked, leaving behind not ashes, but a community tempered and strengthened, its bonds forged in the crucible of shared danger. Martha's own life had settled into a rhythm of deep, abiding peace. The frantic energy of her youth matured into a serene and steady grace. Her hair, once dark as a raven's wing, was now shot through with threads of silver, a map of the years written in light. Her hands, though still capable and strong, now moved with the deliberate pace of one who has learned the profound value of each moment. And in the center of this peace sat her daughter, Miriam, no longer the tiny fevered child or the wide-eyed girl, but a young woman herself, her own life a budding promise. Around them, on woven mats in the sun-drenched courtyard of their Corinthian home, sat a circle of other young women, their faces bright with the unlined hope of youth, their eyes fixed on Martha. This was her most cherished duty, the culmination of every story, every prayer, every moment of silent strength and desperate faith. She was passing it on. Her voice, a low and melodic instrument worn smooth by time, began to weave the familiar tales, but she did not speak of them as history. She spoke of them as a living inheritance, a legacy of love written in the lives of women. She spoke of Sarah's laughter not as doubt, but as the bewildered, joyful prelude to a miracle. She spoke of Miriam's watch by the river, framing it as the moment a sister's love changed the course of a nation. She recounted the hidden courage of Jochebed, the loyal love of Ruth, the wisdom of Deborah, the risk of Esther, the prophecy of Huldah. She did not gloss over their fears or their flaws. She highlighted them, showing how God's strength was made perfect in their very human weakness. These were not superheroes. They were mothers, sisters, daughters, and wives just like them. Their faithfulness was the thread that had stitched the tapestry of redemption together long before the world knew the name of Jesus. She looked at the young faces, at her own daughter's attentive gaze, and she saw the same questions she had once carried, the weight of expectation, the flutter of fear about the future, the desire for a life of meaning. She spoke to those questions without them having to voice them aloud. She explained that the traditions they learned, the lighting of Sabbath candles, the preparation of meals, the nurturing of children, the quiet support of a husband, were not chains, but channels. They were the practical, daily ways this legacy of love was carried forward. Each act of kindness, each moment of patience, each choice to trust in the face of fear was a stitch in a new section of the eternal tapestry. They were the next bearers of the story, the next keepers of the flame. As the afternoon light began to mellow, casting long golden shadows across the courtyard, Martha fell silent. The stories hung in the air, a fragrant incense of faith and fortitude. Then she rose slowly and walked into the cool, dim interior of her home. She returned moments later, cradling an object in her hands with a reverence usually reserved for a sacred scroll. It was a simple, unglazed clay jar, its surface worn smooth in places from the grip of countless hands, its color the deep, rich terracotta of Judean earth. It was the very jar she had carried to the well as a 12-year-old girl, the vessel that had felt so heavy with the weight of a predetermined future. She held it out to Miriam. Her daughter's hands, young and strong, reached for it, their touch gentle as they closed around the familiar, rough texture. Martha's eyes, old and wise, met Miriam's, young and hopeful. No words were needed to explain its significance. The jar was a testament. It was the weight of duty, yes, but also the solace found in rhythm. It was the memory of dawn pilgrimages and the shared burdens of womanhood. It was the symbol of a resilience that had been tested by storms of fear and persecution and had not broken. It was chipped in one place, a small imperfection from the night a stone had shattered a jar by Jason's door, a permanent reminder of the cost of faith. This simple earthenware vessel contained the entire story: the silent strength, the whispered tales, the healer's touch, the empty tomb, the hidden room, the community of love. It was all there, held in her daughter's hands. Miriam's fingers traced the chip, then the smooth, worn curve of the handle. She understood. This was not a gift of an object, but the transfer of a legacy. It was a symbol of the ordinary earthenware lives they were called to live, lives that, when filled with the living water of faith, could become vessels of extraordinary strength, comfort, and hope. Martha's final, most profound character moment was this silent bestowal. She was entrusting her daughter, and through her, all the young women watching, with the clay jar of their shared heritage. She was passing on the legacy of love not as a finished story, but as an ongoing song, trusting them to carry the melody into the future, to fill their own jars, and to pour themselves out for the world in the same pattern of faithful, resilient love. Chapter 24, The Redemption Song. The evening was a soft lavender veil settling over Corinth, the distant cries of gulls from the harbor muted by the gentle hum of the city preparing for rest. Martha sat on a low bench in her courtyard, the familiar rough texture of the sun-warmed stone a comfort against her palm. The day's tasks were complete, the bread baked, the house in order, the voices of the young women she had taught, now a quiet echo in the stillness. In this hushed space, her life unspooled before her, not as a series of disconnected events, but as a single, coherent melody. She saw the girl with the clay jar, her shoulders squared against the weight of expectation. She saw the young wife, her heart a tangle of hope and fear, stepping into a new home. She saw the mother, her spirit forged in the fire of a child's illness, and the disciple, her voice finding its strength in an upper room. She saw the refugee, building a new life in a foreign port, and the leader, her hands building both tables and a community of faith. Each memory was a note, a distinct pitch of joy, sorrow, courage, and doubt. But now, in the gathering twilight of her years, she heard them not as separate sounds, but as a harmony. She saw the divine hand, the master composer, weaving every note, the mundane and the miraculous, the silent strength and the prophetic word, into a grand and beautiful composition. The stories of the women of Israel were not just inspiring tales, they were the foundational motifs of this great redemption song. Sarah's laughter was the first hesitant chord of a promise. Miriam's timbrel by the Red Sea was the triumphant crescendo of deliverance. Ruth's loyalty was a steady grounding bass note of grace, and Esther's risk a piercing dramatic strain that shifted the entire key. Huldah's prophecy was the clear, authoritative theme that authenticated the score itself. Her own life, with its grinding stones and hidden rooms, its prayers whispered in the dark and teachings shared in the light, was a single, humble verse in this eternal anthem. It was a song of a God who did not waste a single tear, a single act of faithfulness, a single moment of quiet endurance. Every woman's story, from the greatest judge to the most anonymous widow, was a vital thread in the tapestry of his redemptive plan. The following Sabbath, as the community gathered in the spacious courtyard of a wealthy believer, the air was thick with a shared sense of anticipation. They had come through persecution, through internal strife, through the daily grind of living out their faith in a skeptical world. They were weary, some of them, their hope frayed by hardship. When the time came for sharing, Martha rose. She did not stand as a scholar or a prophet, but as a grandmother in Israel, her face a testament to a long obedience in the same direction. She held out her hands as if offering them something tangible. She began to speak, her voice carrying the quiet authority of lived experience. She did not preach a sermon, but sang the redemption song she had heard in the quiet of her own heart. She painted a picture not of a distant, impersonal God, but of a meticulous weaver, a divine composer who had always worked through the lives of his daughters. She recounted the stories, not as ancient history, but as the very DNA of their present hope. She spoke of how the faith of a Moabite widow had led to the lineage of David and ultimately to the Messiah. She reminded them how the testimony of women had been the first announcement of the resurrection, the foundation of their entire belief. "We are not bystanders in God's story," she said, her gaze sweeping over the faces of the women and the men. "We are the singers of its verses, the weavers of its fabric. Our collective faithfulness, in our homes, in our workshops, in our quiet prayers and our public risks, is the very means through which His redemption is sung into the world." Her words were not a demand for recognition, but an invitation to see their own lives with new eyes. She looked at a young mother rocking a fussy child and saw Jochebed's hidden courage. She looked at a merchant woman managing her accounts and saw Lydia's faithful stewardship. She looked at the men who supported their wives' ministries and saw the spirit of Boaz. She wove them all into the song, showing them that their small daily acts of love, integrity, and perseverance were not insignificant. They were essential harmonies in the great symphony of grace. A palpable shift occurred in the gathering. Shoulders that had been slumped with weariness straightened. Eyes that had been dull with discouragement began to glimmer with a rekindled light. The air itself seemed to brighten, charged with a collective, inspired hope. They were not just individuals struggling alone. They were a choir, each voice unique and necessary, singing a redemption song that had begun before the foundation of the world and would echo into eternity. Martha, her own verse nearly complete, had given them the melody anew, and in doing so had ensured the song would continue strong and clear long after her own voice had fallen silent. Chapter 25. The Eternal Hope. The fire on the hearth was a low crimson eye in the dim room, its gentle crackle a familiar counterpoint to the rhythm of old Martha's breathing. She sat in her favorite chair, a woven blanket of faded blues and reds draped across her lap, its threads a testament to decades of use and love. The lines on her face were deep, each one a valley carved by laughter, worry, prayer, and an abiding peace that had settled in her bones. In the soft, dancing firelight, they looked less like marks of age and more like the sacred glyphs of a story richly lived. Gathered at her feet were her grandchildren, their young faces upturned and bathed in the warm glow, their eyes wide and reflective. The air was sweet with the scent of baking bread from earlier and the faint, clean smell of the rain that had just passed outside. This was her sanctuary, this circle of listening hearts. And she knew these moments were the most precious threads left to weave. She had been telling them the stories, the same tales that had been the pillars of her own life. She spoke of Miriam and the river, of Deborah beneath the palm tree, of Rahab and the scarlet cord. She did not rush. She let each woman live again in the space between them, not as distant stained glass figures, but as real people, women who had felt fear, who had doubted, who had loved fiercely, and who had chosen again and again to trust in a God who saw them. She spoke of her own journey, of the clay jar and the healer's touch, of the empty tomb and the hidden room in Corinth. She wove her personal narrative into the grand biblical tapestry, showing them how their own family was a living part of this unbroken chain. Her voice was a soft, steady river, carrying them along on its current of memory and faith. As she spoke, a profound and settled peace radiated from her. It was not the absence of struggle, but the deep, hard-won certainty that came from seeing the pattern from its end. She had witnessed the arc of a lifetime, her own and those of the women in the stories, and she saw the undeniable truth. Their faith, however small or hidden it had seemed, had an eternal impact. The courage of one mother hiding her son had led to a deliverer. The loyalty of a foreign widow had secured a kingly line. The testimony of a few grief-stricken women had launched a message that was now circling the globe. No act of faithfulness was ever lost. It was all gathered up, like scattered seeds, into the harvest of God's redemptive plan. This was the hope that was not tethered to the rising and setting of the sun, nor to the strength of her body, which was now failing. This hope was anchored in the eternal, in the unshakable kingdom she had spent her life serving. She looked at the young, believing faces before her and felt no fear, only a quiet, soaring joy. The story was secure. It would go on. The last ember of the story faded into the quiet of the room. The children were still, caught in the reverence of the concluded tale. Martha's hands, gnarled and veined, moved slowly beneath the blanket. From a fold in her garments, she drew forth a scroll. It was not a grand official document, but a simple, tightly rolled parchment, its edges softened from years of handling. She held it for a moment, feeling its familiar weight, a physical embodiment of the legacy she carried. This was her life's work, not written by a scribe, but painstakingly inscribed by her own hand over many years. On it were all the stories she had just told, and more, the lessons learned, the prayers offered, the quiet moments of revelation. It was her love letter to the future, a testament of a woman's faith. She leaned forward, her movements slow and deliberate, and held the scroll out to her eldest granddaughter, a girl of about 12, with her grandmother's same thoughtful eyes. "For you," Martha whispered, her voice a breath of sound filled with immense meaning, "so you will always remember, so you will always tell." The girl's hands, young and smooth, reached out and received the scroll with a gravity beyond her years. Her fingers closed around it, a silent vow passing between them in the firelit space. The legacy was not ending. It was being transferred. The eternal hope was now in her hands, a new chapter waiting to be written, a new voice ready to join the ancient, everlasting song. And in that perfect, peaceful passing of the torch, Martha's own story found its final and most beautiful note.